I'm Margaret Sinclair, 49, and I built a career in the United States Marine Corps on the unglamorous end of it, moving the fuel and the ammunition and the water that keep an entire fighting force alive. For 27 years, I did the work nobody films and let a whole lot of shoulder claps land on other people. But when I arrived to take command of my own regiment, and a man who could not be bothered to learn my face had 2 military police march me off the parade deck in front of everyone, I made a choice about the kind of leader that moment was going to make me, and it changed everything. Have you ever been dismissed, overlooked, or treated like a footnote by someone who never once checked who you really were? If so, tell me your story in the comments. You are not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being wronged, hit that like button and subscribe. It was the fall of 1999, and I was standing in a supply warehouse at Quantico while the rest of my class chased the billets that came with a view. The basic school teaches every new Marine officer the same thing first. Every lieutenant is a rifleman before anything else. But somewhere in those months, the class starts to sort itself, quietly and without anyone announcing it. There were the officers who wanted the infantry line, the ones who wanted to fly, the ones who wanted the jobs that ended up on recruiting posters. And then there was the smaller group, the one nobody bragged about being in, the ones who drifted toward the parts of the Corps that keep everything else alive. Fuel, ammunition, water, repair parts, the long gray columns of trucks that nobody films. I drifted there on purpose. I grew up in a family that ran a small freight business, 3 trucks and a yard and a phone that rang at 4 a.m. when something broke down on the interstate. I learned before I was 10 years old that nothing moves by magic. Somebody loads it, somebody routes it, somebody stays up all night, making sure it arrives. My father used to say that everyone loves the store shelf and nobody thinks about the truck. I understood the Marine Corps the same way. Everyone loves the assault. Nobody thinks about how the assault got its bullets. I was 14 the first time I saw what happens when the truck does not arrive. A hard winter, a driver stranded on a mountain pass, a load of something a hospital 2 counties over was waiting on. I watched my father spend a night on the phone, calm and relentless, solving a problem that no one would ever thank him for solving. And I watched a solution appear out of nothing but his refusal to quit and his willingness to be the person who stayed up. In the morning the load arrived, and the hospital never knew how close it had come to not arriving. And my father ate his breakfast and said nothing about it, because that was simply the job. I did not have the words for it then. But I think I decided that winter that I wanted to be the person who stayed up. The person the room does not know to thank. There is a particular kind of pride in it that the applause people never quite get to feel, and I wanted that pride more than I wanted the applause. Preston Vance was in my company at the basic school, and he was everything I was not. He was tall and easy and quick with a joke, the kind of officer who knew a colonel's name before he knew the colonel, who could walk into a room full of strangers and walk out with 3 phone numbers and a golf invitation. He was not stupid. That is the thing people always get wrong about men like Vance. He was smart enough to see exactly where the attention was, and to stand in it. I remember him watching me sort a stack of logistics manuals one evening, genuinely puzzled, the way you might watch someone volunteer to clean a grease trap. "You actually like the supply stuff?" he asked. "Somebody has to, I guess." I told him somebody did. He laughed like I had made a joke, and he wandered off toward wherever the interesting people were. I did not resent him for it, not then. He was doing what worked for him, and I was doing what worked for me. But I noticed even that early that we were being measured on different scales. When Vance briefed well, people remembered the briefing. When I made a broken plan work, people remembered that the plan had worked and forgot that it had ever been broken and forgot who had fixed it. That is the nature of the job I chose. Logistics is invisible when it succeeds. You only become visible when you fail. The Corps I joined did not run on the things people clap for. It ran on the things people forget to thank you for. I made my peace with that early, or I thought I did. There was one evening near the end of that year that stayed with me for a long time. A colonel was taking command of a unit on base, and a few of us lieutenants stood at the edge of the field and watched the ceremony. The formation, the colors, the slow, careful handoff of a flag from one set of hands to another. I remember thinking it was the most serious thing I had ever seen, this quiet ritual of one person accepting responsibility for hundreds of others in front of everyone who would hold them to it. A senior officer standing near us saw me watching and misread my face. "Don't get your hopes up on the parade billets, Lieutenant," he said, not unkindly. "Log officers keep the lights on. We don't usually get the stage." I said, "Yes, sir," and I kept watching the colonel hold that flag. And somewhere underneath the "yes, sir," without any drama and without telling a single soul, I decided that one day I would earn the right to stand exactly there. Not to prove him wrong, just because I wanted it and because I did not believe the stage belonged only to the people who were already standing on it. I was 22 years old. I had no idea it would take me 27 years to reach that field, or what would happen in the 90 seconds before I got there. By my second deployment, I had stopped waiting to be thanked, and it freed up a remarkable amount of energy for the actual work. That sounds bitter written down. It was not. It was simply the truth of the trade I had learned. Iraq, 2003, was where I understood what my career was going to be and what it was not going to be. I was a first lieutenant then, on my way to captain, running combat resupply for a unit that was pushing hard and fast and burning through everything faster than the plan had accounted for. The plan, on paper, was going to fail. Not dramatically, quietly, the way logistics fails, one shortfall at a time until suddenly a company is sitting in the wrong place with no fuel and no ammunition and no way to move. I saw it coming 3 days out because that was my job, to see it coming. And I spent one long night with a map and a stack of manifests and 2 exhausted sergeants rebuilding the entire sustainment flow from the ground up. New routes, new timing, cannibalizing one convoy to save 2 others. When the sun came up, we had a plan that worked, and over the next week the convoys got through, and the unit never knew how close it had come to sitting in the dirt. Vance was on that staff too, a captain by then, and he was the one who briefed the fix up the chain. He briefed it well. He always briefed well. He stood in front of the commander with the map I had built, and he walked through the solution I had spent the night creating, and he never once said my name. I do not think he even did it maliciously. I think that in his mind, presenting a thing and creating a thing had become the same act. He had spent so many years being the face of other people's work that he no longer noticed the seam. The commander was pleased. He clapped Vance on the shoulder in front of the room and said, "Good work," and Vance said, "Thank you, sir," and somewhere in the footnotes of the moment there was a line about the logistics section's fine support. That line was me. Everyone in that room heard the shoulder clap. Nobody heard the footnote. "We got it done," Vance said to me afterward, and he meant it warmly, which was almost worse. That's what matters, right? I said it was, and it was true mostly. The convoys got through. Marines who would otherwise have been stranded were not stranded. That is the entire point of the work, and if I needed a shoulder clap to do it, I was in the wrong profession. But that night I did something small and private that I kept doing for the rest of my career. I wrote the after-action report, the real one, the accurate one, and I filed it, knowing it would never carry my name in any way that mattered. I did not do it for revenge. I want to be clear about that, because the story I'm telling you could easily be mistaken for a revenge story, and it is not. I kept the record because the truth is a kind of ballast. When you spend years being told, gently and constantly, that your contribution is a footnote, you need something solid to stand on. The record was mine, it was accurate, and it did not depend on anyone else noticing it. That was the pattern, and it hardened over the years the way patterns do. Vance was seen, I was used. He collected mentors, and I collected competence. He got the billets that put him in front of generals, and I got the deployments where things were actually broken and needed fixing. On paper, we were both succeeding. In the rooms that decided careers, only one of us was being watched. I would love to tell you that I rose above it with perfect grace. The honest version is that I got quieter and steadier and better, and I let the work be the argument, because the work was the only argument I trusted. Every so often, someone senior would notice. A commander who had actually read the reports. A sergeant major who knew where the bodies were buried, or in my case, where the fuel had come from. Those people became the spine of my career. They were the ones who, quietly, made sure I kept getting harder jobs because they knew I would do them. There was a sergeant on that second deployment, an old fuel handler named Doss who had been in the Corps longer than I had been alive. and he said something to me one afternoon that I carried for 20 years. We were watching a convoy roll out that we had spent 3 days making possible, and one of the young infantry lieutenants was taking a photograph of himself in front of it for the folks back home. Doss spat in the dirt and said, "They'll all remember riding in the trucks, ma'am. Won't one of them remember who filled the tanks?" He did not say it bitterly. He said it the way you'd point out the weather. Then he looked at me and added, "You do this job right. Nobody knows you did it. You do it wrong. Everybody does. That's the whole deal. You still want it?" I told him I did. He nodded like I had passed something, and he never mentioned it again. I told myself I did not need the parade, and most days, I believed it. But I kept that memory of the colonel and the flag folded up somewhere I did not look at very often, and I never quite let it go. And I kept Doss, too, and my father on the phone in that hard winter, and all the other people who had spent their lives being the truck nobody thinks about. They were a kind of company. When the footnotes got long and the shoulder claps all landed on other people, I reminded myself whose company I was actually in, and it was better company than the people getting clapped for. The morning of the change of command, 2026, my flight was late, and I have thought many times since about how the whole thing turned on 90 minutes of delayed aircraft. I had been selected to command Combat Logistics Regiment 1 at Camp Pendleton. If you do not know what that means, let me put it plainly. It was the billet I had wanted since I was 22 years old and standing at the edge of that field at Quantico. A regiment, hundreds of Marines, thousands of moving parts, the entire sustainment backbone of a fighting force. It was the parade I had been told, gently, all those years ago, that log officers did not get. And I had gotten it, on the strength of nothing but the record I had kept building, one honest report at a time. I was supposed to arrive the day prior, settle in, walk the ground, meet the staff. Instead, a mechanical problem grounded my flight on the far coast, and I came into San Diego late the night before, and I came on to Pendleton the morning of the ceremony with barely enough time to make it. My dress blues were pressed and waiting in a garment bag. I arrived in my service uniform, planning to change on base, and I walked toward the parade deck, already behind the timeline, already out of step with the choreography that a ceremony like this depends on. That is the detail that made everything possible. In a change of command, everyone has a place, and everyone knows everyone else's place. And the whole thing runs on the assumption that the right people are where they're supposed to be. I was the one person on that field whose face nobody had learned yet, arriving from the one direction nobody expected, at the one moment when the escort, who should have met me, had been pulled away by a protocol problem near the reviewing stand. So I did what seemed reasonable. I walked toward the official party myself, meaning to find the general, meaning to apologize for cutting it close, meaning to slip into the rhythm of the morning. The parade deck was filling. A formation of Marines stood in ranks, still and sharp in the coastal light. Families sat in rows of chairs. The colors hung heavy in the small wind off the ocean. It was beautiful, and it was exactly the thing I had wanted my whole life, and I was almost inside it. Preston Vance intercepted me 20 yards short of the reviewing stand. He was a lieutenant colonel now, the outgoing regiment's executive officer, and he had spent the last several months, I would learn, telling anyone who would listen that the command should have been his. He had run the regiment's day-to-day. He had assumed the top slot would follow. When it went instead to an outsider, a logistics colonel he had never bothered to meet, he had taken it as an insult, and he had never once looked up who she was. Why would he? In his world, the important thing about a rival was never their face. So when he saw an unfamiliar woman in a service uniform walking toward his reviewing stand, out of place, off schedule, he did not see his new commanding officer. He saw a problem, a protocol breach. A chance, maybe, to look decisive in front of the general on the last morning that was still his. "Ma'am, this area is restricted," he said, stepping into my path. His voice was smooth and public, pitched for the people nearby. "You need to be behind the cordon with the guests." I opened my mouth to explain who I was. I want you to know that I was going to handle it quietly, that I had no intention of making a scene on a day that was supposed to belong to the whole regiment. But before I could get a sentence out, he had already turned his head and raised a hand toward 2 military police standing at the edge of the field. "Get her off my parade deck," he said, then turning back to me with a small, satisfied smile, loud enough now for the front rows to hear. "Ceremonies for real Marines, ma'am." The 2 MPs came over, a sergeant, Ruben Cortez, older and squared away, and a lance corporal, Tyler Nunez, young, maybe 21, with a face that had not yet learned to hide what it was thinking. Cortez took my left arm. Nunez took my right, but I felt him hesitate. Felt the grip that was not quite a grip. Felt him glance at the sergeant as if to ask whether this was really the thing they were doing. "Ma'am, come with us, please," Cortez said, correct and firm, and they turned me toward the edge of the field. I had spent 27 years learning to stay calm when it counted. I was not going to lose that on the day it counted most. So I did not resist, and I did not shout my rank, and I did not tell them who they were, dragging past 400 Marines in formation. I let them march me. I kept my back straight and my chin level and my eyes forward, and I walked between them across the edge of that beautiful field while the crowd began, row by row, to stir and murmur and turn. I will tell you what was going through my mind, because I think it matters. I was not thinking about Vance. I was thinking about the 400 Marines in that formation who were about to become mine. And I was thinking that the first thing they would ever see me do was be walked off a field by two of their own. And I was deciding in real time that they were going to watch me do it with dignity, because that decision was the only part of the moment I still controlled. You cannot always choose what happens to you. On a good day, you can choose the manner in which it happens. I had spent a career learning that the difference between those two things is almost the whole of a person's character. So I gave them dignity. I gave them a woman who did not flinch and did not beg and did not raise her voice, because I understood, even mid-humiliation, that they would remember it. I just did not yet know how completely. And behind me I heard the adjutant step to the microphone. Captain Marcus Bligh did not know what was happening at the edge of the field. He was 30 years old, precise, running the ceremony by the script. And the script said that at this moment he read the orders. So he read them, his amplified voice rolling out clear and formal across the parade deck, over the heads of the formation, over the families, over the two MPs and the woman between them. "Attention to orders," he said. And then, a beat later, the words that stopped the field. Colonel Sinclair, assuming command. I felt Nunez's hand go still on my arm. For a moment, nothing moved. I have replayed that moment many times, the way you replay the hinge of your own life. The adjutant's voice hanging in the air. My own name, my rank, read out to hundreds of people, while two of those people held my arms and marched me toward the exit. Somewhere in the front row, a chair scraped. And at the center of the reviewing stand, Brigadier General Curtis Rhodes, commanding general of the 1st Marine Logistics Group, the man who had come to hand a regiment to me, rose slowly to his feet and looked out across the field at the woman being dragged off of it. The general did not shout. Men like Rhodes do not need to. He simply walked, unhurried, down from the reviewing stand and out across the open ground of the parade deck, and every eye on that field followed him, and everyone understood, in the terrible slow way a crowd understands a thing all at once, that he was walking toward me. Cortez felt it before Nunez did. The sergeant's hand loosened on my arm, and I heard his breath change, that small, sharp intake of a man doing the math and not liking the answer. Nunez had already let go. He was standing frozen with his arm still half raised, staring at the general, staring at me, his young face working through a horror I almost felt sorry for. Rhodes stopped a few feet away. He looked at the two MPs, and then he looked at me, and something in his face was equal parts apology and quiet, cold assessment of everyone else on that field. "Stand down," he said to the MPs, not loudly. "Release the colonel." The words moved through the crowd like a stone dropped in still water. The colonel. Both hands came off my arms at once. Cortez took a step back and came to attention so fast it was almost a flinch. Nunez looked like he might be sick. "Colonel Sinclair," General Rhodes said to me, and now there was warmth in it, and also something that might have been respect for how I had carried the last 60 seconds. "My apologies for the welcome. That is not how this regiment receives its commander." He glanced just once toward the reviewing stand where Vance stood, and his voice did not change at all, which was somehow worse than if it had. "Whenever you're ready, the regiment is yours. I have been in a lot of rooms in my life where the temperature changed. I had never felt anything like the parade deck in that moment, 400 Marines in formation, hundreds of families, and every one of them recalibrating at the same time, understanding that the woman 2 MPs had just marched off the field was the reason they were all standing there. And Preston Vance. I turned, finally, and I looked at him, because I wanted to see it. And I am not going to pretend I did not. His face had gone the color of paper. He was standing at the edge of the reviewing stand where he had planted himself to look decisive. And I watched the full weight of it arrive in him, watched him understand that the unauthorized woman he had ordered dragged off his parade deck, in front of the general, in front of the regiment, in front of the families, was his new commanding officer. For 27 years I had been a footnote. It took 90 seconds and my own name, read out loud, to make me the only thing anyone on that field could see. Major Diane Holt reached me before I had fully turned around. Diane had been my friend for the better part of 15 years, my operations officer now, one of the small number of people who had read the actual record of my career and knew exactly what had just been made right on that field. She had been sitting with the staff, and she had crossed the deck the second the general did, and she arrived at my side with her jaw tight and her eyes doing a fast, protective sweep of the whole scene. "Are you all right?" she said under her breath. I told her I was fine, and I was. That is the strange thing I keep coming back to about that morning. I was not shaking. I was not furious. What I felt, standing there while the field rearranged itself around the truth of who I was something quieter and older than anger. It was the feeling of a thing I had folded up and put away at 22 years old, unfolding at last and being exactly the size I had always believed it was. Diane's protective instinct was already 3 moves ahead, and I could see where it was going. "Meg," she said very low, "you could end his career in the next 5 minutes and no one on this field would blink. He had you dragged off in front of the general. You would be within your rights." She was correct. That is what made the next thing important. I looked at Vance, still paper white on the reviewing stand, and I looked at the 2 MPs, one rigid with the horror of it, and one young enough that this morning would follow him for years, and I looked at 400 Marines who had just watched their new commander be humiliated and then vindicated in the span of 2 minutes. And I understood that whatever I did in the next 5 minutes would tell every one of them exactly what kind of officer had just taken command of their regiment. "I don't want his career," I said to Diane. "I want the regiment. Those were never the same thing." She looked at me for a long moment, and then something in her shoulders eased, and she almost smiled, because she had known me long enough to have expected exactly that answer, and to have needed to say her piece anyway. "All right," she said. "Then let's go take it." The general was waiting, the regiment was waiting, and somewhere in a garment bag in a building 200 yards away, my dress blues were waiting, and there was no version of this morning where I accepted command of Combat Logistics Regiment 1 in a rumpled service uniform I had flown across the country in. I asked the general for 10 minutes. He gave them to me without hesitation, and he filled the pause with the easy authority of a man who had run 100 ceremonies, letting the adjutant reset, letting the formation stand at ease, turning a disaster back into a schedule. I walked off the field on my own 2 feet this time, my head up, past the rows of Marines who were watching me now, with an attention that had nothing to do with pity, and I changed into my blues in a quiet office with Diane standing guard at the door. And I looked at myself in the small mirror, a 49-year-old woman in the dress uniform of a United States Marine Corps colonel, silver eagles on my shoulders, and I thought about the lieutenant at the edge of the field in 1999. And I told her we had made it. Then I walked back out to take command. The second half of that ceremony was the one I will keep. I stepped onto the reviewing stand in my dress blues, and the change in the field was total. General Rhodes stood beside me, and Captain Bligh reset the script, and this time when the orders were read, there was not a person on that parade deck who did not understand exactly what they were watching. The colors were brought forward. And in the oldest ritual the Corps has, General Rhodes took the regimental colors and placed them into my hands, the physical weight of a flag that represented every Marine in that formation and everything they were responsible for. And I took it, and I held it the way I had watched a colonel hold one 27 years before. I am not a person who cries easily, and I did not cry then. But I felt the whole length of my career gather up in my hands with that flag. Every night with a map and a stack of manifests. Every footnote. every report I had filed knowing my name would not travel with it. All of it had been leading here, and here had turned out to be real. When it came time for my remarks, I kept them short because I have never trusted a leader who needs a lot of words to say a simple thing. I have spent my career on the unglamorous end of this corps, I told them. I have run the fuel and the ammunition and the water and the repair parts. I have spent more nights than I can count making sure that the Marines who get the applause had something to fight with when they got where they were going. I know exactly what this regiment does, and I know exactly what it is worth. I let that sit for a moment. Nobody builds a parade for the people who move the beans and the bullets, I said. So I will not stand up here and promise you parades. What I will promise you is that the person in command of this regiment knows precisely what you do, has done it herself, and will never once treat it as a footnote. That is the standard. We are going to meet it together. 400 Marines can be very loud when they are silent. I felt them read me, the whole formation at once, the way a formation does, and I felt something settle between us that would take months to fully earn, but that started right there. I had thought, in the days before, about what I would say when this moment came, and I had thrown out 3 drafts. Every draft had been longer than the last, and every draft had been worse, because I kept trying to explain myself, and a commander who has to explain herself has already lost the room. So I burned the drafts, and I said the plain thing instead, the thing that was simply true, and I trusted the formation to know the difference between a leader performing humility and a leader who had actually lived the work. They knew. They always know. You cannot stand in front of Marines who move fuel and ammunition for a living and fake having done it yourself, any more than you could stand in front of carpenters and fake knowing which end of the hammer to hold. The proof was in how I talked about the job, in the specific unglamorous details I reached for, in the fact that I knew the weight of the thing I was describing. That was worth more than any speech about leadership I could have written. There is a thing that happens with a formation, a kind of collective judgment that no one announces and everyone participates in. They had watched me be marched off. They had watched me walk back on. They had watched me stand in dress blues and take the flag and decline, visibly, to make the mourning about my own grievance. And they had heard me tell them the truest thing I knew about the work they did, which was that it was worth exactly as much as the work everyone else clapped for, and that their new commander had done it herself and would never pretend otherwise. I have stood in front of a lot of formations in my life. I know the difference between a formation that is waiting to be convinced and a formation that has already decided. That one had decided. I did not earn all of their trust in that ceremony. Trust takes months, and it takes proof. But I earned the benefit of the doubt, which is the thing a new commander needs most and gets least, and I earned it in the strangest possible way, by being wronged in front of them and choosing not to weaponize it. And then there was Vance. The choreography of a change of command does not leave much room for a man in his position to disappear, and I will admit I could have made the rest of that morning a public execution if I had wanted to. I did not. When the ceremony ended and the official party broke, he came to me because he had no choice, and because whatever else Preston Vance was, he was not quite a coward. His face was still gray. He started 3 or 4 sentences and abandoned each of them. "Colonel," he finally managed. About earlier." I looked at him. I let the silence do some of the work, because silence, I have learned, is one of the most honest tools a leader has. Then I said what I had decided to say while I was changing into my blues. 0800, I told him. "My office? We'll talk then." That was all. I did not relieve him on the spot. I did not raise my voice. I did not give the watching Marines the spectacle some of them were braced for. I gave him instead the one thing that would cost him the most, which was a night to sit with what he had done and no idea what I was going to do about it. Then I turned back to my regiment, and I let him stand there dismissed, and I did not look at him again. Diane fell into step beside me as we left the field. 0800, she repeated, dry. "You are going to make him sweat for 18 hours. "He earned 18 hours, I said. The rest of that day was a blur of introductions and briefings, and the 1,000 small things that happen when you take responsibility for hundreds of people all at once. But underneath it, all day, I could feel the shape of the morning settling into the regiment, into the base, into the version of the story that would be told about how Colonel Sinclair came to command Combat Logistics Regiment 1. I had not chosen that version. It had been forced on me by a man who could not be bothered to learn my face. But I understood, even that first day, that a story like that is a kind of power, and that what I did with it in the coming weeks would matter more than the 90 seconds that had created it. Preston Vance was standing in my office at 0800 the next morning, and he had clearly not slept. I had, a little. I had also spent part of the evening doing something I want to be honest with you about, because it is the part of this story that is easiest to get wrong. I pulled the record, not to build a case against him. I pulled my own file, the real one, the accumulated after-action reports, and the honest history of a career that had spent decades running parallel to his. I did it because I wanted to walk into that meeting standing on the truth and not on the adrenaline of having been wronged. Anger fades and leaves you unsteady. The truth does not fade. I had learned that in Iraq with a map and a stack of manifests, and I was not going to forget it now that it finally mattered out loud. He came in and stood at attention, and I let him stand there for a moment. "Sit down, Colonel Vance," I said, and he sat. I did not open with the parade deck. I opened with the thing underneath it, because the parade deck was only a symptom. 2003, I said. Iraq, a sustainment plan that was about to fail, rebuilt overnight, briefed up the chain the next morning. You gave that brief. Something moved behind his eyes. He had not expected to go back that far. You did brief it well, I said. You always briefed well, but you did not build that plan. I did, with 2 sergeants and a map, while you slept. You stood in front of the commander with my work, and you never said my name, and I do not think you did it to hurt me. I think you genuinely no longer knew the difference between presenting a thing and creating it. And I want you to understand that yesterday, on that parade deck, was the same act. You saw a woman you had decided did not matter, and you removed her, without once checking whether you were right. You have built an entire career on not checking whether you were right about people who did not seem important. Yesterday it finally cost you, because the person you did not bother to look at was your commanding officer. He was quiet for a long moment. "Why not just relieve me?" he said finally, and there was no fight in it. "Everyone expects you to. I expected you to. I would have." "I know you would have," I said. "That is part of the problem. Relieving you is easy. I could sign 1 page and you would be gone by lunch, and every Marine on this base would nod and say she was within her rights, and nothing would actually be fixed. The thing that lets you look at me and see a problem to be dragged off a field, that is still here. Firing you does not touch it. So no, I am not going to relieve you. I am going to make you do the harder thing, which is stay and serve under the officer you underestimated, and let that teach you what a night of not sleeping could not." I watched that land. It landed hard. There is a particular humility that only comes from being spared, and I saw it arrive in him, unwelcome and undeniable. "You did not underestimate a stranger," I said, more quietly. "You underestimated your commanding officer in front of her regiment. We both have to live with which of those is worse. My part is to run this regiment as if yesterday never has to happen to anyone else. Your part is to decide whether you are the officer who learns from this, or the one who spends the next year being bitter about it. I am not going to make that choice for you, but I am going to be watching which one you pick." He left my office smaller than he had come in, and I sat alone for a while afterward, with the weight of a thing I had not fully expected. Sparing him had cost me more than firing him would have. Firing him would have been a clean end. Keeping him was a commitment. I had made myself responsible for whether a man learned his lesson, and that is a heavier thing to carry than a signature on a page. Diane thought I was wrong, and she told me so, which is part of why I keep her close. She came into my office that afternoon and shut the door and said what a good operations officer says, which is the thing the commander does not want to hear. "You are betting a lot on a man who has never once given you a reason to bet on him," she said. "If he spends the next year quietly poisoning the wardroom against you, that is on the choice you just made." I told her she was right, that it was a risk. I told her I had made it anyway, and here was why. A command run on the fear of relief is a brittle thing. It works until the day someone stops being afraid, and then it shatters, and you find out that nobody was ever actually with you. They were just scared of you. I did not want a regiment that was scared of me. I wanted a regiment that had watched me be given a perfectly good reason to be cruel, and had watched me decline it and had drawn the correct conclusion about the kind of person they were following. You cannot buy that with fear. You can only demonstrate it once, in the exact moment when everyone expects you to do the other thing. Vance's second chance was not really about Vance. It was a message to 400 people about how their commander used power when she finally had it. Diane listened to all of that, and she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Fine, but I'm still watching him." I said, "Good, so am I." The story was already around the base by then, of course. These things always are. But it was not traveling the way Vance had feared, and the way part of me had, if I am honest, half wanted. It was not traveling as gossip about his humiliation. It was traveling as something about me, about the colonel who had been dragged off her own parade deck and had walked back on and taken command without raising her voice, and who had then, everyone was surprised to hear, declined to destroy the man responsible. In the strange economy of a military base, that restraint bought me more standing than a public relief ever could have. I had not done it for that reason, but I noticed it, the way I had spent a career noticing things. His world contracted in the daylight all the same. The assumption he had lived inside for months that the command was rightfully his looked very different now that everyone knew how he had greeted the person who actually got it. He did not need me to punish him. He had done that to himself on the reviewing stand, in front of witnesses, and the base has a long memory. I watched it from the distance that command puts between you and everyone else. And I made a decision in those first days about what kind of leader the whole thing was going to make me. It would have been so easy to let it make me hard, to become the colonel who had been wronged and never let anyone forget it. I had seen officers organize their entire commands around a grievance, and I knew how it corroded them. I decided I was not going to be that. The parade deck had given me something rare, a command that started with a clear demonstration of exactly what I valued and exactly what I would not tolerate. I intended to use it to build, not to settle scores. The two military police were a harder problem than Vance, and a more important one. I called Sergeant Cortez and Lance Corporal Nunez into my office a few days later, together, and I watched them come to attention in front of me with two very different kinds of dread. Cortez was a good NCO. I had already learned that much about him. He had followed an order from a lieutenant colonel that was, on its face, a reasonable order: remove an unauthorized person from a restricted area, and he had executed it correctly and professionally. His dread was the dread of a squared-away Marine who had done his job and had it turn out to be part of something wrong, and did not quite know where that left him. Nunez was different. Nunez had hesitated. I had felt it on the field, the grip that was not a grip, the glance at his sergeant. He had sensed that something was off, and he had not been able to name it fast enough or loud enough to stop it, and he had been carrying that for days. "At ease," I said. "Both of you, sit down." They sat, carefully, the way people sit when they are not sure the chair is real. "I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the obvious," I said. "You two were put in a bad position by an officer who was wrong, and you did not know he was wrong, and I do not hold the fact of it against either of you. Following a lawful order to remove an unidentified person from a restricted area is not a crime. So let's set the guilt down. That is not why you're here." Some of the tension went out of the room. "Sergeant Cortez," I said, "you did your job correctly. I want you to know I saw that and that I am not marking you for it. But I also want you to think about something. The order was lawful. Was it right?" Those are not always the same word, and part of being a good NCO is knowing the gap between them and knowing what to do when you are standing in it. You will be a senior Marine someday. Marines will follow your orders the way you followed his. I want you thinking, from now on, not just about whether an order is lawful, but about whether you would want to be standing where I was standing when it was carried out." "Yes, ma'am," he said, and I could see him actually turning it over, which was all I wanted. Then I looked at Nunez. "Lance Corporal," I said. "You hesitated." His face did something complicated. He thought he was about to be corrected for it. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said quickly. "I should have. I felt like something was wrong and I didn't. I should have spoken up." "Yes," I said, "you should have, and I want you to hear the next part very carefully, because it is the most important thing I am going to say to either of you." I leaned forward. "You hesitated because something felt wrong. That instinct is the single most valuable thing you brought onto that field, and almost everyone spends their whole career learning to suppress it, because it is easier to just follow the grip of the person next to you. Do not lose it. Do not let anyone train it out of you. The only thing you did wrong was not trusting it fast enough. So that is your job now. Learn to say it out loud, faster. That is a skill, and it can be practiced, and I am going to help you practice it. He stared at me. Ma'am, he said. You heard me, I said. The Corps spent a lot of years teaching me to be overlooked. I am not going to run a regiment that way, and I am not going to waste the one Marine on that field who trusted his gut. Report to my sergeant major. We are going to find you the right path. That instinct of yours is worth growing. He left standing straighter than he came in, and I recognized the walk because I had walked it once myself, a long time ago, out of a room where a senior officer had told me the parade billets were not for people like me, and I had decided quietly that he was wrong. I had not been able to give my younger self anything but stubbornness. I found I could give this kid something better. I could give him a colonel who was paying attention. I checked on him a week later, informally, the way you do. My sergeant major reported that Nunez had come into the mentorship serious and hungry, that he asked good questions, that he had a habit already of speaking up a half second before everyone else noticed the problem. That half second is the whole game in our line of work. A logistics failure that gets caught a half second early is a paperwork problem. The same failure caught a half second late is a company sitting in the dirt. I had spent my career being the person who caught things a half second early and got no credit for the catch, because a disaster that does not happen is invisible by definition. Here was a 19-year-old with the same wiring, and I had the rank now to make sure the Corps grew it instead of grinding it down. There is a symmetry to that which I did not miss. The thing that had made my whole career invisible was the same thing I was now in a position to protect in someone else. Command turned out to be, in large part, the chance to give people the thing you were never given. I had not understood that from the outside. From the inside, it was most of the job, and the best part of it. Vance, in those same weeks, did something I noticed and did not mention. A resupply problem came up, a real one, unglamorous and complicated, exactly the kind of thing that never makes a briefing slide. He solved it. Quietly, competently, without theater, without positioning himself in front of anyone. He just fixed it and moved on. It was, I suspect, the first genuinely invisible good work of his career, and he may not even have known he was doing something new. I logged it, the way I log everything. I did not praise him for it. It was too soon, and praise would have made it a performance again. But I saw the first thread of the officer he might become, and I let it be. The weeks turned into a season, and the regiment settled under me, and I want to tell you about the evening I finally understood what the whole thing had been for. Command is not a series of dramatic moments. That is the thing the ceremonies get wrong. Command is mostly a long, patient accumulation of ordinary competence, thousands of small decisions that no one will ever thank you for, which is a thing I happen to be extraordinarily well prepared for, having built my entire career out of exactly that material. The regiment ran well. My plain, unshowy style, which had been invisible for 27 years, turned out to be exactly what a logistics regiment wanted in a commander. The Marines could tell I knew their jobs. You cannot fake that, and they can always tell. One evening, weeks in, I was going through a box of my things that had finally caught up with me from the move, and I found a note. It was in the effects of my old mentor, Sergeant Major Amos Fenn, who had died 2 years before, in 2024, and whose few belongings had come to me because he had no family left and had, improbably, named me. I had not been able to look through the box until then. I sat on the floor of my quarters and I read the note, which was just a few lines in his blunt, blocky handwriting, written years earlier and never sent. The kind of thing an old man writes and puts in a drawer. It brought him back whole. Afghanistan, 2013. I had been a major then, and Fenn had been the sergeant major of the unit, 30 years in, a man made entirely out of hard-won judgment and zero patience for anyone who confused rank with worth. He had watched me run the logistics for a hard deployment, had watched me do it well and get no credit for it, and he had taken me aside one night in a way that changed how I saw myself. You know why the log Marines matter, Sinclair? He had said. Because the war is decided by the beans and the bullets, and the beans and the bullets are decided by the people nobody films. Every general in history has known it, and every crowd has forgotten it. You are one of the people who decides the war. Don't you ever let a room full of people clapping for somebody else convince you otherwise. And then, later, near the end of that deployment, he had said the thing I never forgot. "One day they'll hand you the parade, Sinclair. I've watched enough of you to know it's coming. When they do, don't you let it change what you learned in the mud. The parade is nice. The mud is where you actually became worth something." There was more to Fenn than that one conversation, of course. He had been the first senior person in my career to read my actual record instead of my reputation. And once he had, he became quietly relentless about making sure the people who decided things read it too. He never told me he was doing it. I found out years later from someone else that a promotion board had nearly passed me over one cycle, and that a certain retired sergeant major had made a number of phone calls he had no official standing to make. He never mentioned it. That was the kind of man he was. He believed that the people who moved the beans and the bullets were the ones who won the wars, and he believed it hard enough to spend his own reputation defending mine when I was not in the room. I owe a great deal of my career to conversations I never heard, held on my behalf by a man who thought recognition was something you owed to the truth, not something you handed out as a favor. I only got to thank him for the ones I knew about. The rest I am thanking him for now. He had been right about all of it. They had handed me the parade. It had been taken away from me for 90 seconds by a man who had never been in the mud. And then it had been handed back, and Fenn had been dead for 2 years and had not gotten to see it. I sat on the floor of my quarters with his note in my hand, and I grieved him properly for the first time. And I thought about how strange it is that the people who tell you the truth about your worth are so rarely the ones standing next to you when it finally gets said out loud. Later that night, I walked out to the parade deck. It was empty at that hour, just the wide, dark field and the flag stands and the coastal air, the same ground where I had been marched off by the arms a season earlier. I stood roughly where the 2 MPs had turned me toward the exit, and I looked back toward the reviewing stand, and I took stock. Here is what I understood, standing there. The ceremony had never been the point. I had spent 27 years thinking that the parade, the flag, the moment on the stand was the thing I was owed and had been denied. But standing on that empty field, I understood that the 90 seconds of being dragged off it were almost meaningless, and so, nearly, were the 90 seconds of being handed the flag. Those were just the moment the truth got read out loud. The truth itself had been built somewhere else, over decades in the mud, one honest report at a time. I had not been vindicated by the ceremony. I had been vindicated by the 27 years that made the ceremony inevitable. I thought about Vance out there on that same field, and I found that the anger I might have expected to feel had quietly gone somewhere and not come back. It is hard to stay angry at a man once you understand him, and I understood Vance completely, because he was the photograph of everything I had chosen not to be. He had spent his life standing where the light was, and the terrible cost of that, the cost nobody warns you about, is that you never learn to see the people standing in the dark. You lose the ability, and then one day, the person in the dark turns out to be the one who matters most, and you cannot see her because you traded that vision away years ago for a better seat. Vance had not been cruel to me on that parade deck out of malice. He had been cruel out of blindness, and the blindness was self-inflicted, and he was going to spend the rest of his career slowly, painfully, learning to see again under the command of the exact person he had failed to see. That was not something I needed to add to. Life was already handling it. My job was just to make sure the lesson had somewhere useful to land. I used to think recognition was something you won. Standing on that empty deck, I understood that it is just the truth, finally read out loud, and that the reading is the least important part. The truth was mine either way. It always had been. The parade deck did not give me my worth. It only, for 90 strange seconds each way, argued with it, and then agreed with it, and the argument had never had any real power over the fact of the thing. I had been a Marine worth commanding a regiment on the morning I was dragged off that field, and I had been the same Marine 90 seconds later when they read my name. And I had been that Marine for years before either. The ceremony was a witness. It was not the verdict. I had been the verdict all along, and that left a better question than any I had carried onto that field. Not what do you do when you are finally recognized, but what do you build once you have the thing you were told your whole life you would never get. I went to bed that night with the beginning of an answer. I want to leave you with a morning, because mornings are where command actually lives, and because this is the part of the story that is not about the parade deck at all. It was a routine day, months into my command, the regiment humming along the way a good unit does when it stops being about any one person and starts being about the work. Diane was running an operation with the kind of quiet excellence that made me glad every day that I had a friend I trusted at my right hand. Lance Corporal Nunes was thriving. My sergeant major had taken him seriously, the way I had asked, and the instinct that had made him hesitate on the parade deck was being shaped into judgment. He was going to be a very good Marine, and he was going to be one because someone had noticed the thing about him that was easy to overlook. Even Vance was doing his job, day after day, without theater. Something in him had shifted after that first invisible good deed. I do not want to oversell it. He was not a different man, but he was becoming a better version of the one he was, and he was doing it under the command of the officer he had underestimated, which was exactly the harder lesson I had wanted for him. That morning we held a small ceremony. Not a change of command, nothing that would draw a crowd, just a routine awards formation, the kind that happens on bases everywhere and that no one outside the room will ever hear about. There was a young logistics Marine, a corporal, who had done something quietly extraordinary during a difficult resupply, one of those feats of competence and stubbornness that keep a whole operation from failing and that never, ever make the news. Nobody was going to photograph her. Nobody was going to clap for the beans and the bullets. I pinned the award on her myself, and I looked her in the eye, and I told her the truest thing I know. Nobody's going to clap for this, I said. I will. She did not fully understand it in the moment. You do not, at that age. But I meant it as a whole philosophy of leadership, compressed into 6 words, and I think some part of her filed it away the way I had once filed away a kernel in a flag, to be understood later, when it mattered. Vance was in the room for that awards formation. He did not have to be. It was not his ceremony, and his presence was not required, and there had been a version of him, the one who greeted me on the parade deck, who would never in 100 years have shown up to watch a logistics corporal get a medal no one would photograph. But he came, and he stood at the back, and he watched me pin the award and say the thing about clapping, and afterward, he did not make a speech about it or try to catch my eye or perform any of the small theaters he had spent a career performing. He just left when it was over, quietly, the way you leave a thing you came to see because you needed to see it. I do not know everything that was going on in him. I am not sure he did. But I know that the man who had me dragged off a field would not have been in that room, and the man standing at the back of it was becoming someone else. One quiet, unphotographed morning at a time. Which is, of course, the only way anyone ever actually changes. Not in the ceremonies. In the mornings, no one is watching. That evening I sat alone in my office as the base went quiet, and I was at peace in a way I had not expected the whole thing to leave me. The parade that had been taken from me for 90 seconds had turned out to be the least important part of any of it. What mattered was the regiment, running well, full of Marines who knew their commander understood their work. What mattered was a young lance corporal learning to trust his gut. What mattered was a note from a dead sergeant major telling me I'd been worth something all along, out loud at last, even if it took me a season and an empty parade deck to hear it. So let me say this to you, whoever you are, wherever you are watching from. If you have ever been marched to the edge of the room while your name was being called, if you have ever been dismissed by someone who could not be bothered to learn who you were, if you have spent years being a footnote in rooms full of people clapping for somebody else, I want you to hear the thing it took me 27 years to learn. Keep walking calmly. Do not shout your worth. Do not resist the grip. Just keep your back straight and your chin level and keep walking and do the work and file the honest report and build the truth one day at a time in the mud where no one is looking. The truth catches up. It always does. And when it finally gets read out loud, you will already know it was yours the whole time. If you have ever spent years being the person nobody thinks to thank, and then watch the truth about your worth get read out loud when you least expected it, I would love to hear your story in the comments. Did you keep your composure the way I tried to, or do you wish you had said something in the moment? And for anyone who has ever been underestimated because of the quiet, unglamorous work they do, tell me, do you think restraint is strength, or do you think I should have relieved him on the spot? I read every comment and I mean it. If this story hit home for you, take a second and hit subscribe. It means the world, and it helps these stories reach other people who needed to hear them too.